Input was by paper tape typewriter, which I thought was a miracle. I further boiled down the check sheet to its barest essentials. The system limit was a handful of data fields, each limited to something like 240 characters. The final data form would fit on a 3x5 card. Jim programmed it, and this became the first of 6 generations of computer database systems I would eventually design. We began digesting the published natural area surveys, Paul badgered the experts, and questionnaires trickled in. We had just enough funding for a part-time typist to get on the computer. As you can probably guess, the entire project wound up being a nearly complete waste of time and effort, except perhaps for educating me. This might be an opportune time to tell you what I think of myself, in case you were wondering. I'm pretty smart. High IQ, intuitive, strong independent thinker, a lot of ideas, but my gears often grind slowly. And I've never considered myself a creative genius, certainly no Isaac Newton. Instead, I'm something of a Bill Gates without the money. A reasonably intelligent person who chose a somewhat unusual career path, had a few lucky insights, and then just kept plugging away, periodically coming up with something new. The new stuff may not have always been the best conceivable, but it was always an addition to an incrementally growing body of knowledge, technology, and information. Gifford Pinchot famously said that the most powerful thing in human affairs is continuity of purpose. Probably everybody that ever did a natural area survey learned from it, but then they had to go back to the real jobs. There was no such thing as conservation biology. Nobody taught a course in natural area inventory. I may have been the first person in the world to be paid a full-time salary to think about this stuff 24/7 year after year, and thus the first person able to learn from my mistakes. About 1973, Jimmy Carter launched a program called the Georgia Heritage Trust to protect places of natural and cultural significance. It had an inventory associated with it, partly consisting of a team that drove the roads to see what would jump out. I had nothing to do with it. However, Rick Jones, our Southeastern Regional Director, was able to acquire about $12 million worth of land for the state at less than 50 cents on the dollar. This impressed Jimmy enough to urge the surrounding governors to cooperate with PNC on similar endeavors. Consequently, John C. West of South Carolina set up a similar program and sent Andy Laurent from his Wildlife and Marine Resources Department to request our assistance on an inventory. Surprising, since we had none of that in Georgia. I didn't want to do it. My department consisted of just me, plus Ray Coulter working on stewardship, Brian Bedford working on ecosystem restoration, and maybe a couple of others. I needed to provide guidance to the entire conservancy, not just a single state. But Pat Noonan, the government co-op king, thought working with government was a good idea, so I agreed to try it. Every heritage program has been a saga with its own cast of characters and surprises. I could have focused here on that, but I think you guys all live this every day. In South Carolina, they had in mind a 2-year inventory. Data management was to be handled by a computer system just starting up for natural resources. The surprise came about 2 months later when I got a call from Andy asking what progress I was making on my computer system. Not wishing to make an image, I said, I'm getting right on it. I scraped some money up to hire our first programmer, Howard Moisenko, and reworked the IBP form, quite a bit larger now than the earlier Honeywell version. We found a local service bureau with an IBM 360 like South Carolina's, and Helmut started programming our second-generation system. On the inventory side, I still haven't learned that much. My main idea still being to ask the experts and go on from there. I knew so little that when I brought in Tom Colsack, our first ever heritage coordinator for a week of training, I was starting to repeat myself by the end of the second day. During a pause, Tom looked over at me and he said, "That's it, isn't it?" I sheepishly agreed that it was. He took an earlier flight to South Carolina. Aside from the inventory methods, though, I learned a few other useful things. I found that our work with state government was eligible for matching funds from the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund under the unlikely but workable rubric of outdoor recreation planning. Hardy Whiting says that the LWCF revelation was his eureka moment when he realized that this just might be a climbable hill. Stateside funding could come from public or private sources, and I'd also tripped to the fact that matching money is magic in funding circles, multiplier effect and all that. Moreover, I've come to a useful generalization that probably still holds true today, that a project of any sort generally falls within a narrow budgetary range. In those days, $100,000 constituted a sort of standard big project. That's what we had from NSF for the IVP. That was the amount for South Carolina Heritage. The scope of the project didn't seem to make much difference. The mundane fact was that if we'd undertaken an inventory of the whole world, we'd have found somebody to cough up 100 grand for it. But by working on a state-by-state basis, we could potentially get startup funding of around $5 million. That's 100,000 times 50, not counting matching money. Stupid but true. Also, I began to like the idea of working with state government agencies because I decided that inventories needed to be ongoing. And the government is good at maintaining bureaucracies as I knew the private sector wouldn't be. Armed with this knowledge, we got rolling. New programs started up quickly in Mississippi, Oregon, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Through an odd twist, the one in West Virginia led to the most transformative breakthrough in heritage history, my second eureka moment. This breakthrough came about because of the nature of the still primitive computer systems. If a given natural area record listed a bald eagle nest as an importance factor, the logical next question was, so what? Well, we really didn't know anything about bald eagles, just a conventional belief that they are rare, apparently declining, and needed help. All we could additionally learn from our natural area records was whether anyone had thought to assert that they existed on any of the other natural area records in our system. Unfortunately, that data was stored on tape, and submitting a query to search for other alleged bald eagles would trigger a sequential read of the whole thing. Processing for this cost roughly $25, a significant amount of money from a 2-year, $100,000 budget. Yep, there's the number again, and we would have wanted to run such queries all day long. Our West Virginia coordinator, Frank Peluri, complained bitterly that using our system would quickly break his budget. Stewing over this problem, I had a sudden thought. I know, I said, we'll invert the files. My initial inspiration was just that by organizing our information differently, we could get away with reading only part of the tape and thus save money. In the very next moment, though, it was as if the scales had fallen from my eyes. In a single instant, I saw the total stupidity and futility of the approach we'd been taking, that I and everyone else had always had everything upside down. Within half an hour of this revelation, I had defined and named the element occurrence to cite, track, and managed area records. Still the backbone of heritage inventory methodology to this day, I think. I got out of touch. I soon began calling my resulting diagram the data salamander from the way I always drew it wiggling across the page. It wiggled across my whiteboard for many years. Within a few days, I had created first drafts of the formats for these record types, had added the source of information abstract, and had Helmut beginning to program our third generation of database management systems. Of course, vast complexities lay ahead, more on that in a minute. But now in one stroke, our entire business was transformed. We were going to be gathering actual data from any source about bald eagles themselves and the rest of what I immediately called the elements of natural diversity and about their localities or occurrences. From this accumulating information, we would decide which sites were significant targets for conservation. Before, we'd always been asking people to identify the significant natural areas at the starting point, using some vague and indefinable instinct. As our data accumulated, we gradually discovered that from a biodiversity perspective, the instincts of the experts had always been terribly incomplete, and aside from the occasional savage gulf or Pascagoula hardwoods, very frequently just plain wrong. But enough said. You do this every day, I hope, and you're all thinking, of course, how else would you do it? But no one had ever looked at it this way before. And at my moment of insight, I thought I would burst with it. And, that's one. I guarantee you that without that single eureka moment, the whole heritage undertaking would have died a well-deserved natural death, and you wouldn't be here having this meeting. I've been thinking for years about all kinds of things that now came together. For instance, my coarse filter, fine filter approach was inherent in the first eureka moment. Community types as the coarse filter, rare species as the fine filter. You still speak of it that way? Yes. My thinking was that if you came up with a classification of recognizable community types for a state, and then found good occurrences of each, collectively they would capture a large proportion of all the biological and geophysical diversity in the state, say 80%. To do better, you might subdivide the community types by making finer distinctions, say to twice as many, and their occurrence would likely increase the statistical capture of everything else, maybe up to 85%. But diminishing returns would already have set in. So I thought that an efficient way to capture the remainder was to jump to the other end of the abundance spectrum, focusing on occurrences of the rarest species or subspecies or even populations. These, because of their rarity, probably because they occupy narrow ecological niches, are most likely to fall through the course community filter. Moreover, I reason, since such species are probably microhabitat specialists, they're likely to co-occupy areas with other unknown and uninventoried species that are thereby captured as well, along with the peculiar physical, edaphic, and other abiotic landscape features found there. There are a host of specifics about the evolution of these ideas, but no time for them here. Besides, I hope you've gone well beyond. I still believe the coarse filter, fine filter approach was the best and most efficient for conservation inventory and planning, although we eventually augmented it with many other techniques. A word about community classification. I'm in a real rocky ground here. I went and saw Diamond's presentation this morning and it was over my head. I sweated blood over this, as have many others, partly because we all know that communities are not entities like biological species with coherent genomes, isolating mechanisms, etc. And the underlying fluidity is a constant cause of dissatisfaction. Aquatic and marine systems are the worst. If this troubles you as much as it always did me, you must set aside the idea of community classification for its own sake and console yourself, as I did, with the realization that as a coarse filter for conservation inventory, nearly any reasonable classification of discernibly different communities can work. You can continue to wrestle with classification forever, and you will, but in the meantime, inventory and conservation planning can go on. This approach shows that the heritage process is an attempt to model reality. Because of limited resources, it has to be an efficient model. I often recall a remark by Tom Colsack with his pithy, dry wit that he made about the South Carolina Natural Resource Computer System. You remember, the one that was supposed to handle our heritage data for us. A year or two later, we asked him what was happening with it. He said he had low expectations because in his view, that program, which had been by then becoming an early GIS, was attempting to create a roadmap of the state at a scale of 1 to 1. This is something that no one will ever be able to do and wrong-headed on its face. The coarse filter, fine filter is just one of the many efficiencies in heritage methodology that contribute to the success of the enterprise. That one operates effectively at the level of the individual program. But there are lots of others that result in the network of many programs using standardized methods. Each individual program contributes some partial support, I hope, to a central system group that is thereby able to develop vastly better and more sophisticated technologies than any individual program could afford on its own. The individual programs, in turn, collectively focus more critical thought on the shared methodology and generate ideas for enhancements. Subsequently, an enhanced system can then better serve not just the program that produced the given idea, but all the others that hadn't occurred to yet. And with shared continuity of purpose, the system can just go on getting better and better. Standardization extends to well-defined common terminology that allows for reliable and efficient communication. This has enabled us to amass data upward and redistribute it downward. I compared notes with Keith Carr and Larry Master on what we all agree was a vital step, our creation of the central databases. The original central databases were created to provide a taxonomic standard to relate all the rare species being tracked by the local inventories. It would have drained vital resources from every program if they had to do this for themselves, and the results would have been non-uniform, complicating efforts to share data. We started with pretty well-defined taxonomies for all vertebrates and vascular plants, thanks to John Cortez from the latter, and gradually added many invertebrate groups and non-vascular plants. We also made attempts to track community elements where they overlapped state boundaries. Still not very successfully by the time I left. I hope we've done better. Range-wide element planning was what I was pushing just before I stumbled. Of course, the individual programs focus on the rarest species, but because everything is rare somewhere, after a while, nearly every species was receiving some attention.